Hello from the Florida swamplands. My name is P.S. Pergy, and I study queer games and social media at the University of Central Florida. And I'm so excited to be presenting my paper, Monster Power, Rebel Heart, Gay Sword, Queer Structures and Narrative Possibility Empowered by the Apocalypse Tabletop Role-Playing Games. Now a quick overview of this talk. First, I'm going to examine the legacy of Powered by the Apocalypse tabletop role-playing games and queerness, with attention to recognizing the difference between queer cues and queer structures. Second, I provide a case study of queer structures across 3 modern Powered by the Apocalypse games. I show how these elements reshape and actively support queer narrative possibility. First, a quick look at the tricky legacy here. Tabletop role-playing games are a traditionally conservative medium growing out of wargaming culture. Early tabletop role-playing games featured limitations on character gender and even labeled queer identities as sexual disorders. Broadly speaking, the evolution of queerness in tabletop role-playing games, like queer video games, has followed a 2-pronged path. Industry-supported games have made limited effort towards basic representation, while independent TRPGs consistently push the boundaries of queer game possibilities. Now, the hobby has changed drastically in the last decade, and especially over the course of the pandemic, pushing its digital connections in what Trammell has called the new digital economy of TRPGs. It's important to note that tabletop role-playing games are taking advantage of their digital affordances, and now the table is everywhere. Specifically, actual plays and podcasts like Dimension 20 and Critical Role have elevated tabletop role-playing games in mainstream media and drawn in marginalized players previously alienated by the hobby. At the same time, indie TRPGs are funded and circulated through Kickstarter and itch funding, while markets like itch.io and DriveThruRPG are central hubs for indie game distribution. And finally, virtual tabletops, or VTTs, have opened the door to players not comfortable at the local game store, and now games are often developed for online play and distribution. Now, I want to clarify a few of the terms that I'm going to be using, the first of those being queer cues. Stenros and Savonen have conducted several studies of the history of queer representation in tabletop role-playing games. They argue that even the most fleeting mention, a veiled remark, would signal that a game world does indeed feature queer people. They later refined this, writing, "Cues for queer play remain a controversial issue. The publisher and designer, the creators of the text, signal if queer play is tolerated, encouraged, or expected." So we can see queer cues as both overt and subtle signals that invite queer audiences. But while mainstream tabletop role-playing games like D&D have finally begun to include such cues for queer players, mainstream TRPGs have also struggled to develop meaningful queer structures. Queer structures are an important step beyond queer cues. While cues are crucial to signaling to new queer players that they are welcome in the space, queer structures engage queer play at deeper narrative and mechanical levels. Avery Alder defines this best when she writes, "Games are made queer when they have structural queerness. Structural queerness is fundamentally about challenging the frameworks of how stories get told. It's about subverting systems through queer mechanics and creating new ways of seeing desire." Building on the work of queer game designers like Jay Dragon and queer game scholars like Bo Ruberg, my paper argues that in the same way that physical structures of a play space anticipate, shape, and encourage the possibilities of play, so too the structures of a role-playing game shape emergent narrative possibility. In this sense, my analyses of these games focuses on how their mechanics comprise larger structures of play, and how those structures support queer narratives. Now let me give a quick example of a queer cue versus a queer structure. Tabletop role-playing games often invite players to list their or their character's pronouns on the character sheet, and this is a cue to players that knowing and respecting pronouns is important, and it is a signal that the game world does indeed feature queer people. But let's compare that to Jay Dragon's role-playing game Sleepaway, which includes the following prompt. For each camper, choose 2 genders, one from each column. In column 1, we have genders like masculine, feminine, full, and empty. In column 2, we have words like cicada, fox, eagle, and pillbug. By prompting players to choose 2 genders, and consider the multiplicity of gender, Sleepaway structurally reshapes the game narrative with queer possibility. While both takes on pronouns are important, one mechanic leaves space for queerness, while the other actively supports queer interactions. With that said, let's turn now to the games in this case study. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to be looking at 3 recent tabletop role-playing games. Apocalypse Keys by Jamila R. Najati is inspired by monster spy media like Hellboy and Men in Black. It was released in alpha on itch.io, but the game was later picked up by Evil Hat for development thanks to fan support. And the game is not actually out yet. It's forthcoming sometime next year by Kickstarter. Thirsty Sword Lesbians by April Kit Walsh was funded by a Kickstarter that raised just shy of $300,000 US. It was published by Evil Hat and is now available in hardback or digitally. Void Heart Symphony by Mina McJanda was likewise funded by a Kickstarter and distributed through itch.io. The game is also heavily inspired by the Persona 5 video game series. Now, each of these games are powered by the Apocalypse, meaning they have a shared connection to Vincent and Guy Baker's Apocalypse world and that lineage of games. They rely on playbooks that designate the different roles that the characters take in the game. Likewise, gameplay is oriented around moves, and moves pause and shape the action of the fiction, and generally involve dice rolls or choices. Finally, play and the fiction are structured as a conversation, broadly, between one MC and the players. While it's a little beyond the scope of this talk, my paper also discusses how these games draw from two other influential PBTA titles, Masks by Brendan Conway and Monster Hearts by Avery Alder. Thirsty Sword Lesbians is the most genre-flexible game in the case study. As the book states, anywhere that swords cross and hearts race, Thirsty Sword Lesbians are there. The playbooks in this game draw from sword lesbian archetypes, such as the Nature Witch, who's an oblivious horse girl, or the Infamous, an escaped henchperson. It's also the most commercially known game, with its own third-party license, powered by lesbians, and, as of last week, a fully funded supplement, Advanced Lovers and Lesbians. In Void Heart Symphony, characters are rebels, mundane people with the power to enter demonic, otherworldly castles. Castles contain the reflections of a vassal, a powerful evil figure, and defeating vassals changes reality in the city. The rebel playbooks, such as the Authority, the Icon, and the Heretic, note characters' civilian strengths and otherworldly powers. Finally, the rebels must also manage a host of relationships, called covenants, that are represented by tarot cards. Last up is Apocalypse Keys. In Apocalypse Keys, players are monstrous agents working for a secret occult government branch called the Division. Investigating other monsters, the players are trying to prevent Harbingers of Doom from opening Doom's door. Each monster agent playbook, such as The Last and The Surge, foretells a doomed future. As characters embrace their powers of darkness, they risk becoming Harbingers themselves. Now I'm going to specifically focus in on 5 queer structures that are present in all these games: safety tools, conditions, personal doom, bonds, and their engagement with media inspirations. First up is safety tools. All of the games in this study incorporate safety tools that set the boundaries of play, and these include the X card, which immediately stops the game if a player is made uncomfortable, script change tools that allow players to rewind, fast forward, or pause the narrative, and the CATS sheet that the MC can use to clarify the concept, aim, tone, and subject matter of a game. And finally, a system for sharing lines, topics players don't want to exist in the story, and veils, things they don't want to see on screen. Each of these games takes these and other tools from the TTRPG Safety Toolkit by Kiana Shaw and Lauren Bryant Monk, and highlights their importance. Rather than asking players to agree to terms or relying on implied consent, these tools are based around shared boundary setting, active consent, and mutual satisfaction. Brendan Conway's Masks developed a system called Conditions, which reimagined the mechanics for harm and violence used in Apocalypse World. As Masks notes, how much physical harm can an invulnerable space alien take before they go out? Masks isn't about that. In Masks, characters' responses to getting punched are far more important. Rather than tracking physical harm, each of these games tracks characters' conditions. In Void Heart Symphony, characters can become angry, callous, cowed, overwhelmed, or scared. In Thirsty Sword Lesbians, angry, frightened, guilty, hopeless, or insecure. And Apocalypse Keys takes a different approach, as the conditions vary by playbook. For example, the Last might become distant, merciless, or despairing, while the Fallen becomes lustful, forlorn, or obsessed. Characters who mark too many conditions become defeated, and conditions can only be cleared by using support moves or letting the characters lash out. Conditions queerly reimagine damage and pain, focusing not on the infliction, but on characters' responses, encouraging players to express and feel what we aren't supposed to feel. Each of these games also share a structure I call personal doom. In Apocalypse Keys, players accrue ruin for using their powers of darkness. Characters become torn between as their doomed future pulls them closer to becoming harbingers themselves. In Thirsty Sword Lesbians, each playbook features a unique balance with personal doom. The Chosen has a destiny that they must embrace or reject, while the Beast has a feral meter. In Void Heart Symphony, characters build resonance with 2 cards in the modified tarot, called the World and the Void. The world is you matter, a hand reaching down to pull others back up to their feet, whereas the void is I matter, fists raised up in defiance against a hostile universe. This tension is at the heart of these games, the struggle between an internal devastating power and the healing of community. These games also use bonds, which track the connection between characters. These bonds can be rivalry, friendship, or love. In Apocalypse Keys, characters bond with each other, NPCs, and their doomed future, what the darkness demands of you. In Thirsty Sword Lesbians, characters gain strings, as in heartstrings, on other characters, and these can be spent to change roles. And in Void Art Symphony, characters nurture covenants, gaining support from, but also having to meet the needs of, non-player characters. Bonds support a queer world of social entanglements filled with empowerment, grief, needs, and desire. They reshape influences between characters, opening possibility for play amidst rivalry, love, and friendship. And finally, each of these games reimagine the queer potential of established media. Despite Persona's queer premise of teens fighting cultural battles via costumes and inner demons, the series is riddled with queer phobia, as Jordan Youngblood has pointed out. Likewise, the Hellboy franchise rarely explores queerness directly, yet the themes of dual monstrosity, alienation, and transformation demands queer remix. And Fire Emblem Three Houses, an inspiration for one of Thirsty Sword Lesbians' adventures, is popular with /shippers online, but the game itself has serious queer-baiting problems, as I note in my collaborative paper on Three Houses coming out later this month in Game Studies. Each of these structures open queer possibility in the narrative. I want to highlight some of the shared outcomes that come from these structures. Firstly, these games encourage and create safe boundaries to feel deeply and often. As Rubric says, let us play anger, let us play what hurts, let us play in ways that are just as different as we are as players. From disaster lesbians to monster agents, the characters in these games get to explore messy identities beyond heroism and victory. The games reward the mass. Likewise, these games set boundaries and recognize the political context to play. As Void Art Symphony says, if we want a better world, we'll need group solidarity and a dream of a better way, just like these games' rebels. They also build on a queer tension between a destructive, powerful force rooted in the self and a healing but demanding force rooted in community. The games also reframe violence. Conditions acknowledge that being defeated is different from being killed, and these games resist violent optimizations and are even wary of the emotional violence of conflict. Finally, each game evokes scenes where characters support each other, driving roleplay that focuses on teamwork and tension, healing and community, relationships, and reciprocity. It is important that we move the bar beyond queer cues in narrative gaming. Notably, not all of these structures are exclusive to queer experiences, however. They support marginalized play across identities and challenge storytelling systems. These games represent only a small distillation of queer powered by the Apocalypse games, and TRPGs more broadly. Queer folks are making games in every genre of the hobby. And finally, queer structures are not mutually exclusive with queer cues, but rather support queer play and the queer players already here. In the end, it's my hope that this case study can not only draw greater attention to the important work of queer, independent tabletop role-playing games, but provide a chance for game scholars and designers to learn from these structures and imagine new modes of play, new playgrounds, and new possibilities for queer interactive storytelling. Thanks so much for your time. Here's a link to my Twitter. I would love to talk about any of this. Please feel free to reach out to me. My DMs are open. Hope you have a fabulous rest of the conference. Bye!